Good afternoon. It's Thursday again, 4 p.m., and it's time for another Digital Transformation Thursdays. Today, our topic is artificial intelligence, and we're very excited to have this show. So AI is touted as uh, the technology that will drive the next industrial revolution. So if the, I don't know, I'm trying to think, I think they're saying that if two or three industrial revolutions already, there's the original industrial revolution that started with the steam engine. And I guess you could say that the second industrial revolution was driven by data. And perhaps now this industrial revolution will be driven by artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence represents
a series. It's an intimidating concept. Sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around it, but it involves machine learning and neural networks, and hopefully today our speakers will be able to provide us with more information, and we walk away today with not only hopefully a better understanding of AI, but also a clearer understanding of what its limitations are. Maybe we shouldn't be afraid of AI, because AI isn't HAL 2000 from Space Odyssey 2001. It's not out to get us. I remember watching that film. What's this about Steve Jobs, about his life, and one of the reasons why he wanted the Macintosh to smile was because of HAL 2000. Because HAL 2000 in Space Odyssey 2001. Maybe I'm saying the number wrong, but that computer was out to kill everyone on the ship, and so he wanted to have a friendly spin on computers, and I think that's what we need, a friendly spin on artificial intelligence. For our first speaker, we have Ralph Regalado. He is the CEO and founder of Senti Labs Inc. He is a graduate with the BS in Computer Science Software Technology from DLSU. He also has a Master of Science in Computer Science from DLSU as well, and is currently pursuing his PhD in Computer Science on Natural Language Processing. He's currently studying, taking some courses in Stanford University on Artificial Intelligence Design, a professional program, Natural Language Processing, Deep Learning, Machine Learning. He was for a time a consultant for Nokia, and he was also in the academe teaching at De La Salle University as assistant professor from 2014 to 2018. At the UP Manila National Telehealth Center, he was the technology lead, and he's currently a development expert in machine learning, as certified by Google. So I'd like to introduce Ralph Regalado. Ralph?
Hi, Attorney JJ. Good afternoon, and good afternoon, everyone who's here with us today to discuss this interesting topic. Okay. Let me share my screen. Okay. I'm assuming everyone can see my screen and everyone can hear me. Okay, so I'll head straight. So for today, I'll be discussing about artificial intelligence, and to relatively have an easy understanding as to what a technology is, and hopefully I will be able to do that. So majority of the people that I've talked and interacted, especially those who are not familiar with artificial intelligence, always associate artificial intelligence with robots, especially the Terminator, because like it's a common movie in which people are scared about that at some point in our lifetime, robots would overtake humans. And we're going to look into that. Are we going to head to that type of future, or is that future not going to come by? So what we see and what we have been experiencing now in terms of how AI is being used is we're seeing collaboration between humans and artificial intelligence. So we're seeing that some of the tasks that are common or repeated tasks are being transferred to robots or being transferred to machines to enable them to do those tasks efficiently. So it's not just it's not meant to replace someone's job, but it's meant to help humans to execute some of those tasks that are boring for us, that we feel repetitive for us. And on the other side, that's where humans would actually be useful because they need to still like maintain all of these systems. They need to be able to also help explain why does the decision made by this machine actually think of that decision. So be able to explain why those decisions are made by the machines are relatively important, and be able to like actually train by adding more data, by putting intelligence on the machine itself. And we're seeing a lot of those happening. We are actually consumers of artificial intelligence ever since, and we didn't notice it. So if you're using emails, that's already using artificial intelligence, and they're using a technology called email spam detection, which tries to understand the contents of your email and automatically label if this is going to your inbox or it is going automatically to your spam. And it tries to help us um, not be a victim of cyber attacks, which is like common, right? So it also continues to evolve because more and more people are also leveraging the technology itself for evil use. That's why this technology is also constantly evolving as how spams are actually crafted and created in the future and even today. Besides that, we are also fond of using a lot of recommendation systems. If you're using Netflix, if you're using Amazon, if you're using Spotify, all of those technologies are powered by artificial intelligence, and they are using a technology called recommendation system. And if you are an avid or a fan of using Netflix, so the recommendation system there helps you find a specific show that is relevant to your interest. Same goes to with Amazon's recommendation system. It tries to look into what have you purchased in the past, what are your historical history of like views on a specific product, and try to associate it on a bigger audience and how they purchase data. And they use all of this recommend data to actually recommend which products would be appropriate or recommended to you by the engine. So same goes also with how Spotify developed the recommendation system. So it's also based on how you interact with the system itself. So what songs or playlists that have you played? What items have you like click on and rated and like, and what other users have listened and like as well, trying to understand all of those interactions happening on the system and trying to provide you new music and new environment to actually interact. So a lot of those existing systems have been there that we have actually been using. If you're using Facebook, if you upload pictures, automatically it would identify images. So it's using a technology called face recognition, right? So it's there. It's part of the technology that we have been using. It's just like it's more on the back end rather than like in a complete system that is relatively new to us. It's already embedded on a lot of systems. And if you're using, for example, iPhone or even Android phones, you can trigger Siri or you can trigger Google Assistant, and you can actually talk using your natural language or voice to perform specific tasks such as searching or playing a music or having all of those questions that you have in your head and you're just lazy to type it. You can just like use your voice to trigger a search on your phone. So all of those are enabled by this technology called artificial intelligence. And it's also used in a wide array of industries and field. It's used in NASA. So it's relatively hard to look into our galaxy and be able to identify which of those stars are planets or even are even a star. So they actually try to capture all of this data. So and they are detecting how the light travels. So as you can see here, if this is like a planet, you can see that there's a change of like the light value or the brightness value of that specific star. and they use this information and data to observe all of the stars in available that they can actually capture and absorb to try to identify if this specific star is a planet. Okay, so they are actually using all of these data. Imagine if we're doing this manually, it would definitely take us years, right? So it's impossible for us as humans to that we can actually do it, but it will definitely take us time. But if you're empowering this capability to aid using machines, so we can actually do our specific task quicker and faster. So it's also used in healthcare. There's a lot of like research revolving around cancer detection to be able to also look into your pupil and retina to help you understand health symptoms. A lot of those is happening. And in Japan specifically, they are actually developing robots intended for their aging community. So you can see in the images here that they are actually constructing robots, and you can see that the robots are not that like a Terminator look-alike, but it's more of a friendly robot in a sense. And as what you can see here, it's not yet that intelligent. They just only perform a specific function. In this case, carry you from one point to another, not yet incorporating understanding of how you speak, or probably understanding how you are actually seeing things across the environment. And it's also been used in agriculture, and this is relevant in our context here in the Philippines, right, in which we're an agriculture country, and it's also been used in that space. So one application of it is they had developed a mobile application that aids farmers to identify and detect if there are what are these plant diseases, so that they would know how to actually do precision farming on their own manual effort, right? So at the same point in time, they also like put sensors to cows and identify if these cows are sick so that they can immediately separate them from the herd. So all of these capabilities are powered by artificial intelligence. Again, merging other technologies as well, such as mobile devices, mobile app development, and then sensors, which would definitely include IoT. For social good, there's a lot of like usage here. I think in Brazil, they were able to create and place devices that listens to sounds of illegal loggers, so that once it's detected, it would automatically ping the rangers in their offices to go to the specific location. So imagine if there's only few resources monitoring all of this, it would definitely be a challenge for them to take care of the forest itself. They're using technology to enable them to see what's happening on the ground, and so that they can immediately take action. So, and some of the client use cases that we have used artificial intelligence. So we have helped a company build an optical character recognition solution that helps them automate their form processing. I think optical character recognition has been there, but it still has quite some challenges in our context, because when you upload images, sometimes it's a photocopy version of that image. You have different variations of pictures and such, which makes the machine challenge in terms of like understanding all of this content. So how do we help them is we automatically extract information from these documents and place them into a database format, so that it would be much more easy to consume and much more easy for our clients to understand where those data are coming from. And we also like built a custom engine that is able to understand local languages. We know that Philippines is home for around 180 plus languages. We ourselves are constant, are multilinguals. We speak Tagalog, we speak English. Sometimes, probably some of you who are coming from the provinces are speaking a different like language, right? And use that in one sentence. So it's kind of challenging, right? So we have built a system that is able to understand nuances in the language and to be able to understand that. And where is it relevant? It's relevant into our marketing, for example, to understand what are your complaints that you post on social media. It will definitely help them understand all of those, right? So people are confused as to like what is artificial intelligence, what is machine learning, what is deep learning. Because there's a lot of like technical terms, right? So to give clarity on that, so artificial intelligence is like the main branch of science which relatively deals with helping or making machines solve problems that are commonly associated with human intelligence. It's either teaching or understanding language, or it's either using your eyes to understand what's on the images. So if the challenge or if the problem is intended to solve and using human intelligence is where artificial intelligence used. And in the early days of artificial intelligence, they just use a context called rule base, meaning like if, for example, in the doctor, if you are 37 degrees and above, you are, or 38 degrees and above, you have fever. If it's below, you don't have any fever. So it's at the early days of artificial intelligence, it's as simple as that. You just generate rules, and the AI itself would just check on the list of rules. If it complies on those rules, then the prediction would be you have a fever or you don't have a fever. So I think in the context of COVID, right? So if you have this, you were able to get in contact with someone that is positive, or you go in a place in which majority of those are positive. The rule will be you probably have a potential that you have contracted COVID. So it's relatively rule based at the early stages or early years of AI, which is in the 1950s. But today, since it's already like improved, we now are able to create machines that is able to actually construct rules by themselves just by sharing data. So instead of us crafting rules, it's the machine who are crafting the rules based on the data that we provide. So this is where machine learning comes into play, in which the machines learn from experience. So instead of us telling them what to do, or telling them that this should actually, if you do this should actually be the output, it's the machine who tries to infer that based on the data. And in 2014, you have a new technology called deep learning, which is again, it's a different algorithm inside machine learning itself. So nowadays, when people talk about AI, they always like refer to machine learning, because they need to get or capture a lot of data to generate machine learning, what we call like machine learning models, and we're going to cover later. So artificial intelligence, they have two types of it. So you have narrow intelligence and general intelligence. Narrow, if you say narrow, it's because it can only perform one task, right? So if the AI can just only detect images, then it's just only performing one task. It's narrow intelligence. If the AI can actually do a lot of tasks similar to what humans can do, I can speak, I can actually move my hands, I can move my head. That's what we call that artificial general intelligence. It can perform multitude of tasks all at the same time. And in terms of where are we right now on the field itself, narrow intelligence is a lot of development of that. So you can see recommendation system, which recommends you products, and you can see face detection that actually identifies faces. And in the field of artificial general intelligence, it's still on its early stage. Okay, so going back, we discussed about machine learning. As mentioned, it's actually allowing us to understand, build machines that is able to understand how we actually do specific tasks just by exploring and providing data. So in machine learning, you just need to identify what's a task, ano ba yung experience, meaning like what do you need to train or on the machine itself, and you have a measurement, a performance measure in a sense. So in general, there's a lot of like tasks depending on data. So you have, if we're dealing with text data, we're doing what we call as like natural language processing, and it's definitely a huge field. So if you are dealing with text data, you can explore natural language processing, and you can see a lot of like contents here that you can explore. If we're dealing with images, if we're dealing with videos, so the technology that we're going to use is called machine vision. So it's again a task inside artificial intelligence. So if it's text, it's natural language processing. If it's videos and images, we're going to use machine vision. And these are some of the tasks that you can do in machine vision. So going back into machine learning, so how do we now do machine learning, right? So if I'm going to create a project now, we discuss all of those concepts. If I'm going to now immerse myself into building machine learning, what should I consider and what do I need to do? So in definition, so machine learning is a way to use standard algorithms to derive predictive insights from data to make repeated decisions. So we're dealing with four concepts here. So algorithms, you have data, predictive insights, and repeated decisions. So if we're talking about algorithms, there's a lot of like algorithms there out, and it's a continuous development of algorithms. That's why you have deep learning. This is continuously improving, and there's a lot of like cool academic field and scientific field who are continuously pushing the boundaries of knowledge into understanding how to create new algorithms. But if you're going to just start first, immediately explore machine learning, there are already existing algorithms that you can use. So if you go back to your algebra base, you have linear algebra. So it's one of the common algorithms that you can use in machine learning. And another important aspect of machine learning is data. So it's either you have your own internal data in your companies, or you can actually generate data by yourselves. So it's either actually acquiring existing data or you generate data. So very, very important aspect is you have data for you to build machine learning systems. Okay, and sometimes expectation is you need to have an AI team, you throw them with data and assume that data would be valuable immediately. No. Sometimes you work with subject matter experts. So me, myself, I'm not familiar with Filipino. I need to work with linguists. If I'm going to work or build machine learning system intended to healthcare, I need to work together with experts, like with radiologists, with doctors. So it's not just that if I'm an AI engineer and an ML engineer or a researcher by myself, I know how to build it. But in terms of like what data is valuable, it's the subject matter expert that has a say for that can actually help us understand what data are valuable, right? If I'm dealing with legal documents, I don't know what's important in a legal document, so I will be asking probably Attorney Las or Attorney JJ to help me understand it because they're the subject matter expert. So if you're working with data, it's not just like the data, but also subject matter experts who knows what data are valuable. And besides that, so once we are actually have captured data, we use this data to actually do predictive insights or repeated decisions. What do we mean by this? So a lot of people assume that if I'm going to do a task, automatic AI na yun or machine learning na yun. No. So for example, in manufacturing, if we're doing visual inspection, so just a type of like an AI system. If we're in the marketing and we will want to do recommendation system, that's an AI system. If we are in sales and we would want to sort which leads are important or which leads are going to generate on sales, it's used leveraging artificial intelligence. So it's not the challenge is like identifying, is this AI system or is this not AI system? So this is one of the challenge when you're going to work with machine learning, because sometimes it could be construed as it can do everything. No, it can just only do a specific set of tasks given if we have a lot of data. So we're going to look into the aspect of law. This is like a recent report by Bloomberg in which that they asked a sample size of around 331 in-house and law firm responders on how they are actually using artificial intelligence in law and legal, and they have been using it in legal research, in e-discovery, document review, drafting tools, contract management, litigation analytics, and compliance or risk analytics. And based on my interaction to lawyers and some of my friends who are on the legal, so some of the existing use cases that are commonly used right now includes automated extraction of metadata from legal documents. So for example, given a document, I need to extract their important information. What are the important information if the document type is this? If I'm dealing with a different document type, if it's a patent, what are the important information that I can extract there? If it's a binding contract with business, what are the important information there? So automatically extracting all of those information and tagging it as metadata is one of a specific use case that is relevant for legal. And you do that because you need to actually do what we call as intelligent document search. And again, as paralegals, I think paralegal experiences is more on watching suits. So like I've seen character where it's like searching a lot of documents on one huge office and at a limited amount of time, right? So the intelligent document search enables you to do the specific task very, very quick because it automatically identifies what are the relevant document based on the search keyword that you actually type. And it tries to build that knowledge base that these are the similar cases and these are the similar, for example, judges, these are the similar discussions about that specific topic. So our use cases involve document validation, form completion, and legal analytics. So is your company, so we've been talking about a lot of use cases since I'm running a lot of time and I need to speed things up. So is your company or how your company needs to be ready for artificial intelligence? So number one is, does your company generate data? So it's a very critical aspect that you need to identify if you have existing data or if you don't have any existing data, can you generate your own data, right? So it's either you use your existing data or you create new data sources for you to enable creation of machine learning systems. So in existing organizations, especially from our experience on the enterprise, sometimes data are compartmentalized. So you need to like be able to understand, are this data compartmentalized? How easy for me to access these data? Because sometimes the data in sales and the data in marketing can actually be merged together to make the data make sense, right? And another question is, how well do you know your data? As mentioned a while ago, working with subject matter experts would help us understand better what data is valuable and be able to understand what decisions are made using this data, and the frequency of those decisions are very critical for us to see, is AI really relevant for the project that we would want to aspire and create. Okay, so if we're going to build specific systems or machine learning related systems, first is understanding if we're going to have data and to be able to create a holistic look as how we can generate data. In the legal space, there's a lot of data, right? Contracts, that's already a form of data. But in other public industry, it's a challenge to create data. So how do we now create data? And to be able to break down data silos, because all of those data are relevant, so we need to make sure that we have access on those data. And we need to understand and learn about your data. It can also like involving private information. So how do we deal with private information? Does it have an impact if we remove all of those information from our data, right? So we need to learn about our data. And initially, for some of the clients that we work, we actually very important to start with pilot projects first, so that they would know the impact of that project within the organization, because before they fully develop it into a holistic system embedded into their company. And when we're working with machine learning models, very, very important, and it has the most value if we're doing it with the real-time data. Meaning, are this prediction that we're actually capturing from the machine learning system, is it doing that prediction real-time, right? How frequent are those? I have one client that they're doing the prediction just only once. So it would definitely not have that value. I would not even suggest to like build a machine learning system if the decision is like once per day. Because like machine learning model has its value if we're dealing with real-time data. For example, visual inspection in manufacturing, right? Since they're producing a lot of chips, for example, or products, to be able to understand which products are good to go to the groceries, for example, are very important. Okay, and it needs to do that very, very quick and fast. So what are the strategies to incorporate artificial intelligence? So first is to assess and understand, do you really need artificial intelligence as a company, right? So first is the technical diligence, meaning does the technology can actually do that task? Because sometimes it's possible that your ideas might be impossible to do given the current technology limitations that we have. So first is technical diligence, to be able to understand also, are the data available, is the data enough, and do we need artificial intelligence for that solution, right? Because sometimes we really don't need AI. Okay. Next is business diligence. This is where we try to understand and assess what's the business impact. Because again, we're creating this initiative because we would want to understand if AI in itself has a huge impact in our organization or business. So we need to understand, will this lower the costs? Will this increase our revenue? Well, is this like a product that I will be offering to my clients to help me launch a new product? Okay, so we need to understand what's the impact of that on the business, right? Because we don't want to invest on something that has no impact on the business, right? So this is where we try to work on the first phase with the business owners, with the company executives, and to understand what are the unique use cases within the company. So once we have identified, for example, a use case, then organizations can now proceed with a pilot to understand further and better how the solution works. And if the pilot is successful, they can now move into a full development, deployment of that project, then do the system integration. So a lot of that consideration, it's not just, it's a fancy technology, I would want to use it. You need to also consider holistically how will the system affect humans also within the offices, and how the system would affect integration of that to the existing ecosystem of your company and business. So I hope I was able to impart new knowledge. I'll be happy to answer a lot of questions later. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you for that talk. So moving on, our next speaker is to talk about the legal aspects related to AI. We have Attorney Lars Serso, who's a senior associate at Dicini Butet Dicini. She's a graduate of the UP College of Law in 2015, and she heads our fintech practice. She's also a consultant on e-commerce, fintech, digital platforms, and data privacy at the UP Law Center's Technology Law and Policy Program. She's been recognized by various law lists, including Legal 500, where she was named as Asia Pacific Next Generation Partner. And for more recently, we just found out last night that the Asian Legal Business Awards named her for the Philippines one of the up-and-coming or rising new lawyers in the country. She has advised several fintechs and IT startups and companies, and she heads the firm's legal education initiatives for startups. And she regularly assists clients in BSP license applications and compliance projects. So I'd like to call on Lars to present. By the way, just in case Lars is actually coming in from Tabuk, up in Cagayan, no? As I always get it wrong. You're in Kalinga. That's right.
Kalinga, yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, Sir JJ, and thank you, Sir Ralph. Sir Ralph, yeah. For that brief but very comprehensive overview of AI and machine learning. So for my part, I'll be talking about the legal risks inherent in AI, and mostly in implementing AI tools and other AI use cases. So I believe Ralph already gave a brief description as to what AI is and as to what machine learning is, but just to contextualize this presentation further, and I mean, as most of you would know, like lawyers are suckers for definitions, so just to put in some context, What is machine learning? So it could be summarized as the ability of a machine or a computer to modify its programming on the basis of inputs or on the basis of data that it would be consuming. So that's important in understanding how AI is used in a lot of applications. So in understanding legal risks, we should note that AI can't be considered alone or as an independent concept. So its importance and also its ability to spur further growth and innovation lies in how it interacts with other technologies, as how Ralph described it in his presentation. So you could see the application, the interaction of AI and various IoT devices, mobile devices, and yeah, it's important to consider AI in the context of the entire tech ecosystem where it acts. And just to give further examples, so like for example, the application of AI with mobile devices, right? So this could be in like navigation systems like Waze or Google Maps, or as mentioned a while ago, in the recommendation systems of Netflix or Spotify, where it generates a set of recommendations based on your previous usage of the application. And then also recently, there was this new technology from Microsoft on image captioning, where it seeks to help blind people to understand their environment. So for example, there's a dog, the device would say there's a dog, etc. So it seems harmless enough, but if you push it further and understand how AI is applied in other industries, you'd see how it could expose individuals and persons to certain risks or certain harms. So for example, in insurance, there's this one article I found where AI is used in designing products for individuals based on information gathered from IoT devices. So, or IoT sensors, so for example, your applications in your phone or your other wearable technology. And then insurance companies could come up with usage-based insurance, and presumably the amount of premiums that you need to pay and their assessment of the risk they're taking it by insuring you would be based on the volumes of data already collected from other devices. Of course, it in a way enhances customer experience by giving increased personalization, the same way that Netflix does it or Spotify does it. But as you could see, it comes at a cost. And then also, I think this is like in the United States, they've been implementing AI in their criminal justice system. So I understand that their police force have been using AI systems in order to determine where they should, for example, send members of their ranks, because there might be a greater propensity for crime in a certain area, etc. But I think the more impactful one would be how the judicial system is implementing AI when a judge makes a decision about a certain case. So how do they do it? Basically, if there's a defendant, the AI tool would take in a bunch of data about that individual, so educational background, past encounters with the law, age, address, etc. And then based on those inputs, the AI would come up with a score on the propensity or the possibility that that defendant would commit another crime. So yung possibility for recidivism. And the judge would take that in along with other factors when making the final verdict. So those are more parang harmful applications of AI. And then now, as lawyers, I guess the next question would be, how should liability be established with regards to decisions made based on AI, or with regards to harm caused by AI, and who is responsible ultimately for AI? So there are certain ways by which legal scholars and lawyers have viewed or have presented or have analyzed AI in terms of liability. basically here are the options. So AI as property, AI as semi-autonomous beings, or AI as autonomous entities. So the last one, that's closer to the Terminator example presented by Ralph earlier. So AI as property. Basically, when you treat AI as property, you'd be applying existing rules on liability or on torts to AI. And generally, the rule there is the owner of the property would be responsible for all damages resulting from that property. So, for example, building owners, manufacturers of products, etc. And then the law right now, I think in a bunch of jurisdiction already provides a mechanism by which the proprietors would be able to shift liability eventually to the engineers or to the manufacturers. So in this concept, we see the application of traditional legal concepts to a technology that's continuously evolving and some issues, right? When you apply this legal framework to AI, we see that it's not that straightforward. As you would have gleaned from the presentation earlier, the creation of or the development of AI involves not just the owner of, let's say, the software itself or the tool itself, but it also, the way that it works would be attributable in the programmer and also the trainer that inputs the data, trains it further, etc. So now the question is, how do you designate or distribute liability among everyone involved in the creation of AI? And then another proposal is to view AI as a semi-autonomous being. So the same way that the law treats minors or children, students, and employees. And basically, you look at AI as as a minor. So any harm or any damage caused by the AI should be the responsibility of the parent or the guardian. Or if the AI did something harmful, then the owner of that AI should be answerable or should be able to compensate for the damages brought by the AI. And then last is the concept of looking at AI as autonomous beings. So basically, this says that you could consider AI as having its own distinct legal personality, similar to corporations. And the main argument for this, although I think technologically we're not yet there, the main argument for this is AI, if it continuously develops or how it's acting now, arguably could be said to be intelligent enough to make its own decisions. However, that argument is a bit problematic because, like, for example, what's that movie? Yung may savant syndrome siya. So I forget the title, but the character there would have an IQ of, I think, like a crazy high level of IQ. Definitely intelligent. However, the law still treats people with that syndrome as someone with no legal capacity. So the fact that an AI could reach levels of intelligence that humans couldn't do is not sufficient to argue that it should have its own legal personality. And as I think, just to summarize, I think the main legal issues when it comes to AI is how to manage liability in case of harm, how to identify responsibility and accountability. And of course, we can argue that the traditional concepts of tort and causality could apply, but it's not that easy to identify, for example, whether the AI is the proximate cause of the harm. Or, like, for example, with machine learning, could you really say that the developer of the AI is at fault when for example, the licensee or the user was responsible for inputting messy data or harmful data into the AI, and therefore, arguably, you can say that the data was the cause of the harm. So, for example, there was this chatbot developed by, I think, Microsoft, and then they deployed it. Eventually, the chatbot started to say like racist things and harmful things. And the explanation was it started to gather data from Twitter. And eventually, it led to a racist chatbot. So some approaches. One legal scholar, si Lawrence Lessig, proposed that in order to manage the risks posed by AI is that you build legal barriers or you build the rules that you want into the code of the AI. So it sees programmers and coders as legislators and rule makers. And at the point of coding pa lang, the programmer should ensure that all applicable law and regulations are already considered. So sure, that's fine. Ayun nga, I think this is where Isaac Asimov's law of robotics could come into play. I think this is always the question, like for example, for automated vehicles, self-driven vehicles, right? If a vehicle has to choose between hitting another car sa road with a human being inside that other car or going to the sidewalk and hitting a pedestrian, what would it do? So anyway, I guess by incorporating itong laws ni Isaac Asimov in his fictional books, arguably you could create an AI that will not harm human beings. Ayun. However, this proposal is only feasible for AIs that don't do machine learning or that don't do machine learning. So as we've seen in Ralph's presentation, the ability of AIs to really provide greater efficiencies when it comes to business processes, etc., lies in its ability to reprogram itself when it gathers more data. And so the initial code set by the programmers could easily be disregarded, and new ones will be programmed into it. And then as the AI gathers more and more data, this would also raise the issue of opacity or the algorithms of that AI tool being some sort of black box to the point that it becomes less and less understandable, that a human being couldn't figure out or explain why it would make certain decisions. So these issues must eventually be figured out if you want to build trust into the AI system. And I think right now where we're at really is we look at AI as lawyers as property. So the normal rules on product liability would attach on negligence and on data privacy. And actually, there are certain regulations certain jurisdictions that have already issued their own guidelines when it comes to AI implementation. So just for purposes of this presentation, these are the rules issued by the European Commission when it comes to AI implementation in their jurisdiction. And it's consistent with the proposal to look at AI as property. And I believe Singapore also issued its own guidelines for the use of AI when it comes to financial products. Here in the Philippines, we don't have any AI-specific regulations yet, but I understand that the DTI is coming up with its own guidelines when it comes to AI vis-a-vis consumer protection. So anyway, back to this one. In this proposal, which I think makes sense, and it's consistent with our current regulations, it says that a person operating technology that poses increased risk of harm to others should be subject of strict liability for damages resulting from its operation. So, and then it also says that a person using technology that does not immediately pose an increased risk of harm to others should still be required to abide with some set of rules or some codes of conduct. And that if it's proven that they breach those rules or those set of guidelines, then they should be liable for breach for failing to follow those rules. So this would be relevant, for example, if you're a software company that develops AI, best practice would be for you to come up with your minimum set of standards for your trainers, for your programmers that they should follow. In the event that they don't follow that, you should be able to go back to them for breach. Ayan, so some other proposals from the EU. The destruction of the victim's data should be regarded as damage that's compensable. And then lastly, in response to the proposals that AI should be viewed as an autonomous system, it says that it's not necessary to do that, as the harms that these technologies may cause can and should be attributable to existing persons or bodies, which ultimately would be the programmers and the owners of those development companies. And just to bring it back home, when looking at AI tools or developing AI tools, it should be noted that these existing regulations would still apply. So, like for example, let's say for data privacy, the development of AI tools, as has been repeatedly said, would depend on the data that you input into it in order to train it to come up with decisions. So, for example, for the ability for self-driving vehicles, right? It should have the ability to recognize cars. So, how do you train that tool to do that? Essentially, just you put in a lot of images of cars on streets, and then hopefully input enough data that it would learn it enough to be able to drive on actual roads. So now that's for cars. But let's say you train an AI tool to do, let's say, recognize faces. Ayan. So the same thing, you input a bunch of photos so that the tool can recognize a face when it sees one. And then in the process of doing that, you will need to process, or you will need to collect a bunch of photos and personal information from individuals. So when you do that training, you should always consider whether you're violating the Data Privacy Act, whether you're getting personal information without consent, and if it's possible, maybe it's not possible for facial recognition, but for some other AI tools, if you could just anonymize the training data that you get, then that would be better, and you won't be under the coverage of the Data Privacy Act. But so stuff like that you have to consider. And ayun. So anyway, managing risks and building trust in AI. I think the AI community has been very active in coming up with best practices and guidelines in building ethical AI and building trust in AI. And ayun, these are some of the concepts that there's a consensus that the AI community has been pushing for. So there should be responsibility when it comes to AI. The end user or the consumer should know who to approach when things go wrong, and there should be remediation for that. The AI should have some element of explainability, meaning the operator should be able to explain how the AI works, how it comes up with decisions without resorting to technical or very academic terms. Accuracy, meaning it's the operator is able to identify sources of error. Auditability, third parties can check and criticize. And I think this is important in order to prevent bias when it comes to AI training, etc. And fairness, that it would consider different demographics. So yun. So I think moving forward, what's the point? I think the point is to not stop AI from developing further, not over-regulate it. In terms of managing risks, it should be considered that codes of conduct and baseline rules should be followed by programmers and trainers. There should be standards for data inputs to avoid bias, privacy issues, etc. And then, yun, I think the main point is to build trust in order to encourage greater use and further innovation. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lars. So maybe we can get Ralph to come back on for Q&A. Wala naman si Lars. But before I so I don't know, I'll just do a shout out to the guys, the people who are with us, our audience. So I asked them where they're watching us from, and just so they're aware. Okay, so we have somebody from San Fernando, Pampanga, North Caloocan, Bulacan, Antipolo, Quezon City, AICS Commonwealth Branch, wherever that is. So malapit siguro sa amin yan. San Mateo Rizal, Marikina, Mandaluyong, Makati, Tondo, Manila, Parañaque City, Las Piñas, Imos, Cavite, Dasmariñas City, Cavite, Trece Martires, Cavite, Lipa, Daraga Albay at at the foot of at the foot of Mount Mayon. Again, Debes, Muscat, Masbate, Tacloban City, Leyte, and Hingog City, Misamis Oriental. So, ang goal ko lang naman dito, Ralph, actually is if we have people from Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, happy na ako. And I think we did that because we have one person from Leyte and we have one person from Misamis Oriental. So we crossed over. Well, some people are, there's somebody from Davao pala. People are still telling us where they're from. URS Cainta, Ternate, Cavite. Wow. Very people from So thank you for logging in. Siguro ako yung maybe I should so first I'd like to thank you for your presentations. It's a bit overwhelming. And maybe let's try to bring it down to something that's easily applied, or at least try to understand how one would build maybe a simple way or a simple AI project where we can demonstrate to people how machine learning would work.
Usually may very simple na daw to sa space namin.
Sorting.
Para yung handwriting recognition, like for digits and numbers. So numbers. So parang detecting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So before you can do something like that, you need to collect data of like different people writing the numbers. So usually parang kino-consider pa nila na dapat same yung sizes ng images because it would have a different effect dun sa data kung malaki image sa small image because of the pixels. So once you have collected all of those data, parang you use several or various machine learning algorithms. Could be like test ka muna ng isang algorithm number 1, and then the model will be built trying to understand paano ba yung number 1, paano ba yung number 2, paano ba yung number 3, up, and so on. And then once you build that model, you can do what we call like testing. So sulat ka ng bago, tapos check mo kung 1 ba yun, or 1 ba yung nahulaan niya, 0 ba nahulaan niya, or hindi. And then you put a measurement. So we use sometimes called accuracy, but it usually depends sa task yung accuracy. So meron tayong performance measure. Kung 50% performance or 10% performance, then something is wrong. It's either you collect more data or you use a different algorithm. So it's an entire cycle. So hindi siya one pass, that's it. So you need to make sure that the machine continuously or nagiging intelligent siya. So and then at some point kung okay na sa'yo yung 80%, for example, before you move that into magamit na siya ng ibang tao, then you move to a production level. Pwede mo siyang integrate sa web application, or pwede mo siyang gawa ng mobile app na pag-take mo ng picture ng handwriting, automatically identify niya na kung 1 ba yun, kung 2 ba yan, or 3. So it's very, very, I hope that was simple.
Thing na una parang tao lang eh. It's like a person, right? Experience teaches you. So when you're a child, you see a doorknob, and then the more times you see different kinds of doorknobs, eventually, when you see something that allows a door to open, you say, oh, that's a doorknob. So you have a lot of data that you learn from. In AI, the way I understand it, so when you said you test, so essentially you have the data that the machine will say, okay, what is similar about this data? And then you program the experiment to say that, okay, if you see 2 eyes, 2 ears placed in a certain way, within a certain from each other distance, maybe that's a cat, or maybe that's a dog, based on the way the nose looks and the features, right? So you have the data, you run 1,000 pictures against that data. And then the next thing you need to know is you need to see, did it accurately predict whether that picture was a picture of a cat? So in other words, there's the data that you test with, and then you have to have success parameters, right? And then after that, if you fail, you can't use the same data. You have to use, I guess, a different set of data, no? To tweak it.
you can actually still use the same data, but you need to make a context sign it. You need to refresh it. Refresh meaning you need to add more data, but you can still use the same. Kasi parang it we have this idea na yung data na available ngayon is just a peak of the entire data of the world. So parang we just need to refresh the data. So adding more would refresh it. So ganun yung context niya. And then for AI kasi, for machine learning context, we're not generating tinatawag kong rules. So for example, we would want to create a system that would identify kung apple ba to or orange. So as humans, mabilis natin ma-identify na pag color red yan, apple. Pag orange, orange yan. But may mga iba pang aspect kasi yung fruits, di ba? Pwedeng sizes, pwedeng smell, pwedeng shape, and there's a lot of features. So yung rules na yun, mabilis sa ating magawa kung limited lang yung fruits, kung dalawa lang yun. But kung lahat ng fruits sa buong mundo, ang hirap gumawa ng rules. So yung ginagawa ng machine learning itself is to generate those rules to enable it to understand what's the difference between fruit number 1 and fruit number 2. And they're using that huge gigantic of data to understand the differences between those fruits.
The limitation of AI, number one, I think, no, is that it has to be a very sort of simple experiment. You cannot demand AI to make nuanced decisions.
Yeah.
You have to narrow down what decisions it is making, what it is supposed to learn. And so that's one. And then second, you have to have the data that will be necessary to reach that conclusion. Because otherwise, if you don't have that data for success, you can't run an experiment. So in a sense, you really can't use, this is, we're talking about machine learning now, no? Machine learning really has limitations on what you can use it for. Of course, you can use it for many things. As you said, for reading stars, right? Whether a star has a planet, right? There's for a solar system, or sakali X-rays, right? Because a machine can tell differences between light and dark, and that's very easy, and they can measure it. So, but in many other contexts, like in places like language, for example, it becomes very, very difficult because saying you can say the same thing in so many different ways, right? And even among human beings, right? There's a difference between sort of what is literally said and what is actually said, right? So there's context, there's, how AI will probably not detect, the early AI will probably not detect sarcasm.
Yeah.
Right? They're just trying to understand what was said.
Yeah. I think even with images, I was reading something like how hard it is for AI to actually detect a moving car, given that there are a bunch of other stuff outside, like trees, etc. And it's difficult for them to identify that it's a car. Yeah. I think it goes to what Ralph said, that we're still in the narrow AI and far from general AI.
The business application now is if you have data that is structured in such a way that AI can learn from that data and therefore make simple decisions, then you can apply AI to a business problem. Say sorting of invoices or sorting, or maybe not sorting, might even be too simple. So what would be like a common use case in a business context for AI?
Common context. So it depends on like which industry vertical you're looking at. So commonly, if we're looking into
marketing, because every company has marketing and every company has collections, something like that. Yeah.
All right. If it's marketing, commonly they're using images and text to identify position of their logo. So for example, if people are engaging with their brands, so they would take a picture and there's a logo available. So they would want to identify if the images has an existing logo or like what objects within the images so that they can infer that the customer workflow, the customer journey, and also like the sentiment itself, which is relevant in not only in marketing but also in politics, right? That when people are expressing their opinions like negative toward that specific topic or positive about that specific topic, or am I negative towards the service of the specific brand? So sentiment analysis is like a common usage in terms of like marketing space. On the back office, this is where OCR is relatively commonly used. because it's tedious, right, to write your receipts into tables. So you need to manually do all of those effort to migrate that into table document. So it's relatively been used as an OCR technology, leveraging the capabilities of AI to automate that process. But we're just like scratching the surface of the capabilities of AI. There's a lot of more, depending on like which industries we're looking at.
There are a lot of questions. Maybe let me see. There's so many. So maybe I'll throw this one to Lars. It's a liability question. Sabi. Foreign corporations, entities like Facebook and Google, are they liable if the damages is done by AI in the Philippines? What do you think?
Sorry, so how's the AI implemented when it comes to...
You're right. There has to be some impact, no? So let's say that.
Let's say content.
Well, okay. So, oh my God, I can't believe I'm saying this, but let's say that because of some AI that Facebook uses, your account was determined to be, say, part of a Russian bot. A Russian, you know what I mean? Like no, right? State-sponsored disinformation, right? And then your account was taken down. But that was a mistake of AI. Right? AI isn't perfect; it made this mistake. And the question is, what if you were running a store on your Facebook page and you were selling stuff, and now you didn't sell? Maybe you lost a big deal. Maybe you lost money. Then you tell Facebook, "Hey, your AI did this to me, so you're responsible."
Okay. Well, I guess there are a lot of considerations. I guess the lawyer answer ko there is, for Facebook and a bunch of other platforms, you probably agreed to terms and conditions, which probably prevented you from, let's say, engaging in spam or engaging robots or whatever other tools in order to increase maybe engagements with your own online store. So I don't think it's a yes or no question. So if you indeed abused the functionalities of the app, then it'll be hard for you to go back to Facebook or some other platform and say that it was their fault. However, if let me give a different example. Attorney JJ, are you there? Ralph, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Lars.
Okay, so parang si Attorney JJ is frozen. But let me give another example. If you watch the legal show The Good Wife, there was this one episode there about a tech company that developed an application similar to Waze, which suggests routes for you to take whenever you want to go anywhere. And then somebody filed a complaint against them because the routes that it suggested would only favor like stores and commercial establishments owned by whites, and it avoided the inner cities essentially. So I think in cases like that, naman, where clearly the training of the tool has some sort of racism or bias, then there might be grounds to lay responsibility or liability. Did you get that, sir?
I actually got disconnected.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I was saying, like, with platforms, it was probably an abuse of functionality. But let's say, like, in The Good Wife, where they developed a system that was racist, it avoided inner cities and favored white neighborhoods. There could probably be a claim against the developer of the AI.
Episode, but I think I know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Where what happened that is that they had AI that talked about whether it is safe to walk in the street.
Yes.
And what happened? And they based that on incidents of crimes, and it turns out, parang in black neighborhoods, it's high, and so the system punches that out. Okay.
Yep. So the system prejudiced commercial establishments there. Yeah.
Is predictive text an AI application, Ralph?
Yes. It's a natural language processing system. So since we're dealing with text, yes, it is a AI system.
highly, parang, how do you call that? Is it, for example, if I'm in the Philippines and I write a certain search term, and then it will be completed by Google, di ba? On the bar. So complete niya, may suggestions siya. And those suggestions are different if I were, say, in China, or if I were in, or well, not in China, they're not in China, but if I were in the US, or even different parts of the US, would you say that that's true?
I haven't like looked into their engine, but initially when I have understand their algorithm, so they try to incorporate like location so that the search would be relevant. So the prediction itself would also like be relevant. I'm not quite sure how detailed is that. Is it like location based, or if I'm on my barangay, I have my own I have my own search term or like prediction that would happen. I'm not quite sure how thorough it is. I'm not quite sure if it's on the country level or like very specific level to my interest. That's I haven't like read into it. But initially they try to put contextual locations based on how you're going to search. So if you are, for example, if you are identified as a technology person, most likely when we're going to search Apple, it's an Apple related to Mac versus Apple as a fruit. So it would have that different context. But I'm not quite sure how probably they're using data to infer that. So I'm not quite sure how depth is that type of uh, limitations or type of filter that they have to do that.
Let's say that I am running a campaign on a particular locality, and I want to change people's minds about a certain person. Let's say it's a campaign, and I buy a lot of ads against my opponent in that locality, and therefore people are clicking on my ads and making posts about my political enemy. Now on Facebook, presumably they're using some AI about what people are interested in. And I wonder whether if I were in that locality and I'm looking for information about that person, whether the Facebook will return search strings related to my ad, and therefore makes the ad campaign more because it's targeted for that area, where it makes my ad campaign more successful, and therefore create this impression about a reality which may or may not be true. In other words, because Facebook tells us, and you think because it's trending on Facebook, it must be something that a lot of people are actually concerned about, when in fact it was probably something that was planted. You think that's AI can sort of inadvertently push public opinion in one way or the other?
I don't want to like mention Facebook, but in general, you can create something like that. So if you're building a social media tool and a solution, you can actually build something like that. So it's relatively dependent on how you design. That's a very key important aspect when you work with AI. It's how you design things, because the way you design things would have an impact on how people will actually use it and towards how people would have an impact to the AI that you're using. So if you're building something that is towards the interest of a specific group without figuring out what your interest is like, then it would be totally biased to that specific group of people, right? This is where the understanding of like bias is key, as one of the important discussions revolving artificial intelligence, right? So if I'm going to create a model that it would keep my feed safe, or it could keep my mind sane all the time because I'm not infected with negative thoughts. If you're going to build a model like that, it would have an impact on me personally, versus like if I'm just going to build a separate model that would just push ads. So a lot of discussions are still ongoing revolving around bias, but it's possible to do it that way. It's possible to design it that it equalize whatever that you build that is biased towards a specific group of people. But it could also like be biased towards your interest as well as a person. So yeah.
Google has an agenda. In fact, I would think that the agenda of Google and Facebook is to make their platforms, useful for people. They want it to be, functional. They don't want it. They really don't care so much about content. They want to push content to people when it's relevant to them. But when you have AI running in the background, there might be this sort of unintended silos, right? people might find themselves within silos, and then what happens is it destroys the ability for,
Right.
discussion. Okay.
Yeah, I think one suggest. I think Attorney Jay, one important aspect probably that social media can actually like put into would be what's the decision making of why that feed actually pop into my wall. So for example, is it because of this type of interest? Because there's no label, right? So your assumption is like you are construed that this is what's happening on the world. But initially, I have an assumption that what's happening on my feed is what's happening on all of my friends on Facebook, but it's relatively designed to look into what contents would gain your interest. So I think it's more of like how I'm going to explainability part, as mentioned by Attorney Lars a while ago. If the systems nowadays would be able to explain why is that content relevant to me? Is it because I'm 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 um I'm keen on this type of products. That's why it's posted. So be able to explain would definitely like help me understand why those content are shared to my feed. So
Yeah.
Makes any sense, but um, what is behind AI when it says when you say it learns, right? Essentially, it looks at data, gobs and gobs of data, and it tries to build an understanding of it expressed in what's an algorithm, right? Basically, an equation that says, if a person has three Lamborghinis, then he must be a rich person, something like that, right? So there's that equation that brings you from point A to point B, and so I think the problem sometimes that creates is that so there's math that's working in the background. I mean, to link certain attributes to another conclusion, right? For the algorithm. In other words, there must be some math that made that it's an parang logical fallacy, di ba? That correlation, there's strong correlation, but correlation isn't causation. So I've had, and there are companies out there, for example, that say how you use your cell phone. Sometimes how you meaning do you put your cell phone face down? Do you leave your cell phone face up? Whether you throw it, whether you charge it every night, those behaviors somehow predict whether or not you will repay a loan, right? So those two things are completely not related, but somehow, so there's correlation, right? So I'm wondering whether the math could be wrong, and therefore you find yourself, because you happen to be the kind of person who likes his phone down, right? You don't get to get a loan anymore. What do you think about that?
that's why it's very important that you work with subject matter experts because probably those who designed that thought, oh, okay, probably there's a association between a high loan purchases for this type of personality and like behaviors on mobile phone. I always go back to how you design things and how AI systems are created and built. So as mentioned by Attorney Lars a while ago, it always boils down to the accountability of those who develop it. Because if you develop it that way, therefore, it would definitely have a prediction that would have a huge impact to certain person in the population, right? So very critical aspect on how you design AI systems that you need to identify which data are valuable. And the one who are actually creating it is not just only who knows AI, but who actually has knowledge about how to do that specific task. Kasi kung nga rin, nag-consult naman ako with credit risk assessor and they didn't even use that data. Why should I even like add that right to my machine learning engine? Right. So it's possible that I just infer it, but again, if I'm going to check with subject matter expert, it doesn't make sense. So I would always like go back to the idea that when you design things, you need to make sure that you have thought about it and have consulted to subject matter experts.
To a subject matter expert. So let's go to the legal profession. So I'm going to throw this to Attorney Lars. So a lot of questions cropping up. And actually, weigh in na rin, Ralph, kasi about, the legal profession, right? You had a slide earlier about things that could be automated in the legal profession. So there was a question about whether it would be unethical for a judge to use AI, in the sense that because AI uses past experience, right, old data to decide new data, under the rules of court, the judge is not. It is inadmissible to use past behavior of a party to determine whether a party did or did not perform a certain act. So, do you think that would be an ethical issue?
Okay.
Or sorry, do you think that would be a legal issue there? Yeah, go ahead.
All right, all right. So I think the reason why people are pushing for AI-based decision making for judges is that number one, to make the process faster, and then number two is to basically come up with fairer standards of making decisions. Because the assumption is it does away with biased judges. However, I think we need to be very careful when it comes to that because the assumption there is all previous data which you will put into your machine learning engine is perfect data. It's bias-free data. And I mean, arguably, that might not be the case. So, for example, in the Philippines, we have a lot of problematic decisions. For example, for rape cases, there are a bunch of weird decisions there, weird assumptions that you may not want to put into your machine learning engine. The same thing with, let's say, damages granted for torts cases. So I think like now, I think the standard when you when someone kills someone on the basis of negligence or tort, I think the damage awarded is only at 50,000, and there are a bunch of Supreme Court cases of like some crazy low amount. Although they grant higher amounts if the person that was injured is a rich person. So, di ba, yung mga weird decisions like that, you don't want to carry that over into an AI tool. So, yun, it goes back to designing an engine or a tool that considers all of those things, considers bias, etc. So, good intentions, but we have to be very careful.
If AI can do legal research in the sense that you ask it a very, very simple question,
Yeah, definitely.
and then just tell you what is the law on this, and then it's up to you, right? So you really can't input all of the facts, but you can ask sort of small questions and ask, well, what's the law if A does this to B, right? What's the penalty? And then
Yep.
it's again eventually the judge will have to make a determination. There's a
Yeah.
question here, and I think it's really more for Ralph because I don't understand, or maybe Lars, if you understand this. Okay, the question is, what is your view on this quote? Okay, information design can be designed to lie, but observations do not. Information design can be designed to lie, but observations do not lie. Does that make sense to you?
Maybe Ralph has a better idea. I feel like I'm way over my head.
I would definitely like based on my opinion, it is my opinion, right? I would somehow like agree on that statement that again the way that you design systems, you can design it to lie, right? So you can design it to like it has a different face and it has a different like value that it can actually do. But when you're going to see its output, it would definitely have a different view of things. So I think I definitely would agree on that statement based on my opinion and how I observe things and my outlook in terms of technology, that observations relatively do not. But again, it depends on how you observe things too, right? Sometimes may mali din sa pagka-observe mo, then definitely you could actually infer na mali na tama pala. So it depends on what's the available data when you do the observations. That's why on AI space itself, very critical yung discussions about explainability because majority of people building it is like thinking of it like as a black box, and I would definitely agree because there's a lot of algorithms out there, and if you ask people building it if they know how that algorithm works, they cannot even like explain how this algorithm works, and it's a challenge if you're not able to explain because you should know why did the algorithm predicted, for example, that this person shouldn't be given a credit, right? And if you weren't able to understand how the algorithm work, it would be a challenge to like explain what are the characteristics and rules as to like why it made that prediction. So it observation is relatively dependent on how many data or like how huge data that you're actually observing. It would make sense if you have much more data. It wouldn't make sense if you're just only looking at few data and make assumptions and make observations on that.
There's a question here, very interesting question on intellectual property, right? And I think this question relates to the way you conduct your business. So if I'm a company, let's say I'm a big retail company, I engage your company, Senti, and I say, build me an AI that helps, say, my sales ladies who are selling shoes, for example. But when somebody's looking for this type of shoe, you push this other kind of shoe because they're likely to buy both, something like that, right? So you have to churn a lot of data to figure this out. Then you figure it out. You come up with an algorithm, a set of decisions that when somebody asks for this kind of shoe or this size of shoe, push them this other kind of shoe, right? So let's say you built that. Now, what does your company own from that? Can your company own the algorithm, or does the algorithm belong to your client? Or do you have deals where you own the algorithm and therefore you walk away with the algorithm? You can take that algorithm and give it to another or use it for another client.
Actually, it depends on the way you build things. If you're relatively building a new algorithm out of it, I feel that it can actually be owned by the company, or it can actually be co-owned by both of the company. I think some of the organizations are exploring that they can actually co-own it. In some cases, the organization can actually own it, but if you're going to own it, you need to be accountable on that model that you're going to build. So it's always not just only ownership, but also if you take ownership, you need to be accountable with any decision it's going to make and how that system would impact, for example, its users. Pag nagkamali ba siya, pupuntahan mo ulit si company na, mali ito. And then, kailangan mo itong ayusin. So parang, ganun ba yung agreement, ganun ba yung arrangement ninyo? And if you own it, is your team capable to actually explain and understand and update that? So sometimes working with an experienced team would definitely transfer the responsibility to them. So how accountable is the company working on it? So it depends on gusto mo talaga kayo accountable or gusto mo yung company that's working on it yung maging accountable. So relatively dependent on that scale.
Topic, which is audit. One way that you can limit or mitigate or address the liability issue is have your AI audited. Not the AI per se, but maybe the data plus the algorithm plus the methodology used. You know, how would an auditor look at that and say, okay, this is good AI or that is bad AI? You know, what role would an auditor play, do you think?
Ano ba tong question?
Contract is basically software code that implements a contract, but it can make a mistake. You know, it's supposed to pay you money or pay you crypto, but it might not pay you crypto at the end of the day. So, I mean, a very simple example would be a vending machine. A vending machine where you put in the money, you press the button, but nothing came out. Okay, so that is a programming flaw, right? So in the DeFi space, decentralized finance space, you can buy insurance against a bug because that would be a bug, right? In the way the smart contract works, you can buy insurance. And one way to determine the level of insurance is you have the code audited. I'm wondering, you think a similar mechanism would be helpful in AI, where other experts look at the work done by a company like, say, Senti, and then make a determination, and then they tell their client, you know, it's a common client, right? So, okay, this AI is probably good, and that way also assess whether or not the level of insurable risk.
I think it's more on the process on how the company protects.
Where were we ba? What was being discussed? Do you remember?
Auditability.
it might be something that would be possible under the circumstances, either to minimize liability, right? To say that this AI actually isn't a bad AI, and that's everything is just coincidental. So, what do you think? Is that doable?
Medyo, it's kind of challenging if you're going to put an audit because the scientific itself aspect of it continuously evolves. So I think it's one of the challenge if I'm going to like, on the aspect of like auditing on making sure that the code is running fine, the code is running like it's I get that point. But in terms of like if I'm going to go back on my scientific hat, it's kind of like challenging if it's bounded to do that because this if I'm going to like redo again the code that it's continuously evolving, right? It's fast. It's crazy fast in terms of like the scientific field itself and creation of models. So I think it's more towards probably the process of um, then the workflow itself. I think that's possible. That can be looked into and review. For example, how do you handle data? How do you make sure that it's private? How do you make sure that when you capture data coming from your clients, you're storing it properly. If you're dealing with PIIs, how do you handle those data? So I think that's much more looking on that aspect. I think it's also a different challenge if you're going to like put that the systems need to reach at a specific accuracy before it gets into production because like in a sense it's hard to put a number because in each of the tasks of artificial intelligence it has a different accuracy or like a different measurement. So usually this measurement is in conjunction or in discussion with, for example, a client on how they feel that it's good for them. So it's relatively hard to protect. In order for you to launch it, you need to achieve 95%. It's kind of crazy because in some of the tasks, it's hard to like reach that 95%. So yeah, I think it's more of like the process on how you make sure that the workflow within the organization is how they handle data and how they process data. And I'm not quite sure. I think one of the things that needs to be like considered and reviewed is how you design things. Because it's hard to put as mentioned by Tanya, it's hard to put regulation on some aspect because it limits the creativity, it limits the scientific sense of like pushing boundary of knowledge, but it has an impact as well if in terms of like flexibility of how you design solutions. That's why on the later era of like things in the artificial community, they just put like Google has their own AI principles that you need to abide on that. But in terms of like how are they abide, I'm not quite sure how they measure it, right? Because it's like a plain and simple paper that you don't need to do this, you don't need to create AI that would inflict warfare and such. So you can also create that type of like principles. But in terms of really executing those principles, I'm not quite sure how do you is it
You
even
check.
possible? Is it possible to like even check it? And how do you check it? All right. So
Possible that sorry, so maybe I step up. If I were thinking, if I'm a company, I'm saying, okay, I want to see if AI is possible for me. Correct me if I'm wrong. Here's my impression. Before I should even call a company like Senti, I have to have a company that has a lot of data, right? That data has to be electronic so that it can be processed. And then I call you, and then I can ask you what can you. Then I think it can be an open-ended discussion about what can I do with this data, and then you can then propose to me how a business case could be made, right, to utilize this data and leverage that sort of intelligence to make my business run better. Is that the way? Is that a fair way to assess, the process of engaging a company like Senti?
it really depends. Sometimes companies has the capability as well. If they have their own capability, then they can actually build. So it's certainly up to them to going to build it internally, build it with a partner, or use existing tools because there are already existing tools, right? You have cloud services now that if you're going to feed them with data, you can perform speech to text or if we're going to input audio, it would automatically convert that into text. So if you're building an application, for example, that leverages that, you don't need to build it from scratch. You can actually use those existing tools. But again, you need to check the white paper and how the data are stored, and you should need to make sure that you're using it properly. Right? So it's either you build, it's either you buy, it's either you build internally, or you like build it with a partner who is more knowledgeable on that space. So
Yeah, no, I hope this is a sort of I guess I did watch something about AI and sort of in the development of AI, and I think what is this neural networks, and so it happens there's some sort of mathematics level to it, right? In a way of how AI, for example, machine learning, for example, how to structure that. So there's a mathematical problem, that or somebody has come up with a solution mathematically, and then that's one problem. And the other problem is, well, there's also computational limits, meaning there's hardware issues and software issues, and computer can only do so much. And my understanding and is that the sort of computer science or mathematical breakthroughs that you are using now to make AI helpful are things that were developed or discovered more than 20 years ago. Is it fair to say that the techniques, the thought processes are actually quite dated? But what now, the thing that cannot converge because of the internet, the data, there's so much data now available, and then second, there's so much computational power.
yeah,
Yeah, is that correct? You agree with that?
yes. I think there's some algorithms that was ideate. They conceptualized that early on, and I think that's one of the contexts that called AI winter because of like the limitations of computing power that they can experiment the algorithm itself because of like limitations. And I think it's this time, probably around 2013 and moving forward, that the computational power is cheap, and then you have lots of data. That's why it enabled that to propel further. That's why majority of organizations such as Google, Facebook have been utilizing artificial intelligence and building capabilities on that because the computational speed itself and the capability is manageable. It's much more cheaper compared to probably running that. And sometimes I experience like building a model which takes probably around 3 hours or like a week or 2 weeks. But right now, when you build, and I'm only using like limited data, probably around 1,000 or like 5,000, right? But right now you have a lot of data that can actually perform that task quicker, like in seconds or probably a minute or an hour, depending on the engine that you're going to use. So yeah.
Computational, in computers, the next development is oh my God, it escaped me. Quantum, right? Quantum computing. So now computers are going to be so much faster, right? The chips are going to be so much faster. It's a different kind of computer altogether. Assuming they make quantum computing available, do you think AI will move also, or do we also need a sort of a mathematical breakthrough also? Somebody has to develop new math so that it could match the computational power. Do you think that that's the situation we're in now?
There's a lot of arguments about that. I think my opinion would definitely differ with other people's opinion in terms of how they perceive what would be the next generation of like innovation. Certainly, there's an aspect of like quantum processing in terms of to be able to like speed up the computational power. Sometimes they would actually utilize more data. Some people would argue that the algorithms are already there. We just need to create data. Some group would argue that the data is already complete, but we need to improve the algorithm. So, for example, the context of neural network was based on neurons in your brain. So they try to like visualize how the brain works, and they put it into a mathematical context to mimic how the brain works. And I think that innovation stopped. I'm not sure if there's new innovation on that. So it revolves around the computational power. Could actually look into the data aspect, could be algorithm aspect that would definitely those three important aspects would definitely drive. So changes on those three aspects would definitely drive changes in the next few years time.
Fascinating yung conversation. I'd like to ask you both to give your parang closing statements. But I'd also like you to give your thoughts on whether AI is something that will replace human beings. I mean, and then moving forward, and then your parting thoughts. So who's for ladies first? Lars first.
Go, Lars.
Okay. All right. So as to that question, will AI replace human beings? I guess I'll take it from the point of view of a lawyer. Like, will AI replace lawyers? I think to it won't completely replace lawyers due to the fact that the capabilities of AI systems now are very, very limited. It's not like we'll come up with lawyer robots in the next 10, 20 years or so. However, definitely, it would drive lawyers to do more high-value work to avoid getting replaced by some AI tools, like, for example, research work. So probably the work done by maybe first-year lawyers would be replaced in a way, but that would only push them to do more valuable work. Yeah. And then last parting thoughts. So AI is a very exciting space. I feel like I myself, like I've been working with Senti and other companies that implement AI tools. However, I feel like I'm still way over my head sometimes. But it's an exciting space. The possibilities are in a way endless. It's definitely going to change a lot of the business processes that we're used to. And then, especially as lawyers, it's important to understand how AI will be a factor in that change, so that it remains. I think, yeah, so that remains understandable. We're still able to be able to identify responsibility, accountability, etc. So yeah, there.
Thank you, Ralph.
Okay, so I think on my side, are we going to reach a future in which like robots would be intelligent? I somehow like thought about it, but probably would not happen in 10 to 20 years, probably 50 or 100 years. And I think what's interesting, this is like me, my creativity, like scientific probably hat, is that what's unique on AI itself and how it's also depicted on science fiction, like scientific movies, is that they're connected to like one huge brain, which is like the cloud, in which it's easy for them to like share knowledge across. Meaning that for what aspect, probably you deploy a system here in the Philippines that look into aspect of how Filipinos use data, and then you look into a different system on US or different like territories, and they get to infer and look into those huge ways of how AIs are going to like be used. So I think that's one of the key different aspect of like how quick it is going to learn. But again, as mentioned, it would definitely be the drivers of like data, algorithms, and computational power that would push people going to reach that type of future. That's why it's very important to have this discussion early on. It's very important to have the conversation continuously going instead of us being afraid about this innovation, instead of us limiting ourselves that we're just going to rest our laurels, leveraging the solutions that we just already are complacent about using. I think it's a good time, it's a high time for us to like explore. And that's why as incentive, we've been doing a lot of like pushing and pushing education to help understand and better understand AI. And as you can see in the actually in the region, there's a lot of usage already. A lot of companies are exploring it, and they're not afraid to explore it, because again, we're just afraid because we don't know it. But if we immerse ourselves and learn the technology itself, it actually prepares us for that type of future. So I think we need to continuously like learn and have this conversation going.
Thank you. No, that's very So thank you for your thoughts. I mean, I agree with that. No, I know there's a lot of anxiety out there about AI and what's the future and how is it going to affect our lives and our future. Will it replace human beings? And I think that's been said with just about every kind of development, major development in technology, where there's concerns about, will people become irrelevant? And what's happened in effect is that actually these tools increase our productivity. And what that means for us, hopefully, I think, is that we are able to go to more high value, less mundane tasks, and maybe even have more free time, right? So if you look at the Industrial Revolution when it started, there was no such thing as a weekend. And now we have weekends. We don't work, at least some people don't work on Saturdays and Sundays. And maybe with AI, a 3-day weekend is something that's going to be the norm. So I think that's one of the takeaways normally. Usually we have a digital transformation Thursdays is that, as the world changes, we really have to, instead of being afraid, we have to understand it and find a way, right? Find a way forward, because in the end it's all about our creativity and how we address the challenges moving forward. So on that note, I'd like to thank Attorney Lars Terzo and Ralph Regalado for this episode, for our latest episode of Digital Transformation Thursdays. And that's it. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.